Hey everybody. So due to all the canceled classes and suspended days of school, I'm just going to go ahead and post Module 29 and 30 lecture online. Please watch this video. Also go onto AP Classroom and complete the Unit 4 assessment. And it'll say Unit 4. It's actually Unit 6 in your book, but the outlines for those two for College Board in our book are not the same. So please go ahead and do that. Please watch this lecture and be ready for the test on not the following class period that you guys show up, but the one after. So today we're going to look at 29 and 30. For 29, we're going to go back and explain conditioning, operant and classical conditioning from not just an environmental stance, but also a behavioral, also a cognitive and biological perspective. And then we'll discuss observational learning and Albert Bandura and his discoveries on modeling. And we'll also look at mirror neurons and how that impacts our social modeling and observational learning. So when we look at cognition and biological predispositions, we have the biological perspective, right? So we are predisposed to learn things that affect our survival. Early behavioralists like Pavlov, Skinner, Kimball believed that really any behavior was capable of being conditioned as long as the organism was capable, right, of that behavior. So we find, though, that however this isn't the case, that the environment isn't entirely responsible for our conditioning and our behavior and our learning, but also there are other factors, as we see in the biopsychosocial approach, right, that we discussed in Unit 1, in which our learning is the result of, yes, environmental, social, cultural influences, but also psychological influences, cognition, and biological predispositions and influences on our behavior, like taste aversion, which we'll look at here briefly. But we are predisposed to avoid threats through our evolutionary ancestors that they may have faced, and this includes all of these three approaches, and still to this day. So when we look at the biological perspective, one of the first discoveries, or really important discoveries, is Garcia and Colling's experiment on radiation. And so what they discovered was that taste aversion illustrates a classically conditioned dislike or avoidance of a particular food or drink that develops after an organism becomes ill from eating or drinking something. Right? So in this case, the rats are learning to make a certain biological association over other environmental associations. In this case, flavored water became really the only conditioned stimulus that produced the conditioned response of nausea. It wasn't lights or sounds that were also presented with the conditioned stimulus that caused that conditioned response. It was the flavor of the water, as you kind of see here in this image above. You have the taste as the conditioned stimulus, the radiation as the unconditioned stimulus, and the nausea as the conditioned response, right? Or the unconditioned response, because radiation will cause nausea. So if we look at Garcia's experiment, first he takes an unconditioned stimulus, and again in this case it's the radiation, and this is produces an unconditioned response. It produces sickness, right? And so next Garcia takes different neutral stimuluses. Okay, and some of those would be the flavored water. Obviously, he also takes water. He uses lights, flashing lights, for sight, and he uses auditory stimuluses like sounds that relate to the radiation. Now, the conditioned stimulus, the flavored water, was the only conditioned stimulus of the three that really produced this effect of learning, this conditioned response of nausea, regardless of whether or not the radiation was in the water. Even after the fact, it learned that that flavor of water was associated with radiation, was associated, therefore leading to a conditioned response, sickness, nausea. So the sights and sounds remained neutral to the rat's learning of this conditioned stimulus. And so this, anyways, the significance in all of this is that taste aversion has an evolutionary purpose in which rats need to avoid certain foods that taste bad because it could lead to harm for them. It could lead to sickness. It could lead to death. It could lead to illness. And so, yes, environmental things like sights and sounds do influence us. In this case, however, they didn't influence the rat's association of the nausea. And so Garcia demonstrated in his research that biology also impacts and is important to our conditioned learning. It's not just lights and tones. So, yeah, so I mean, for instance, let's say that my mother cooks a soup for me, right? And in this soup, there's chicken. However, in that chicken, there is salmonella. Okay? Chicken's bad. It wasn't cooked fully, and I eat it. And I'm eventually going to make an association later, 4 hours when I'm in the bathroom on the toilet, okay, struggling because I have now been influenced by salmonella, which is really nasty, a really nasty bacteria that you definitely want to avoid from poultry. And I'm going to make an association with that soup, probably the taste of that soup. So next time I see that soup, I'm going to avoid it. Right? I'm not going to want anything to do with chicken noodle soup. Okay, if I see it in the store, I'm going to probably get nauseated. Now, if that happens, right? If I get salmonella poisoning from this chicken noodle soup, I'm not going to make that association with the kitchen. So every time I see a kitchen, I become nauseated. I'm probably not going to make that association, and I'm certainly not going to make that association about my mother. I'm not going to become nauseated every time I see my mother because of the chicken noodle soup poisoning, the food poisoning, right? I'm going to make that association with the taste of that soup. So this just is another example of taste aversion and how I'm able to associate my learning and make a connection about what it was that actually made me sick. And it helps me avoid that in the future from an evolutionary standpoint. Okay, so go ahead, pause the video for a minute, answer this question, apply your understanding of taste aversion, go ahead and label the UCS, the UCR, the CS, and the CR, and think of an example, a unique example of taste aversion in your life, something that a time this has happened to you. So go ahead, pause it, and answer the question. Okay, all right, hopefully you paused the video and you did that activity. Again, I could give you another example. Let's say I ate leftover tuna salad in the fridge that my roommate maybe left in there, and I didn't realize that this tuna salad had bacteria on it. Okay. Well, 2 hours later, after eating the tuna salad, I am now vomiting and throwing it all up, and I have serious nausea because I have food poisoning due to this bacteria. Okay, so my taste has caused an association with this nausea. All right, if I am labeling the stimuluses, right? The UCS in this case, the unconditioned stimulus is going to be the tuna salad. All right, the bacteria, or sorry, actually, I messed that up. The unconditioned stimulus is going to be the bacteria, right? It's natural, okay? And that natural bacteria is going to cause an unconditioned response, which is going to be nausea. The conditioned stimulus, or the neutral stimulus, is the tuna salad. It's not the tuna salad that causes nausea, right? It's the bacteria in that. But I associate tuna salad with that unconditioned stimulus, the bacteria. Therefore, in the future, whenever I smell tuna salad, that's going to be my conditioned stimulus to a conditioned response, which will be nausea. Okay, so your example should be something similar to that, of a food or drink that you had once in your life that caused taste aversion. All right, let's look at Robert Rescorla and his findings on the cognitive processes of classical conditioning. So Pavlov believed in the 1880s that all you need to do is pair a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, and boom, you got conditioning. It occurs. But Robert Rescorla, about 100 years later in the 1970s, argued this approach, and basically stated that, hey, I think there are cognitive and mental aspects related to our perceptions and our learning and associations as well. So his argument was that the neutral stimulus cannot become a conditioned stimulus unless there is what's called a predictive value, right? There needs to be a reliable predictor to be able to determine whether or not that CS and that UCS are associated with one another. So an example of this would be of predictability would be if a shock always follows a tone, right? Let's say I touch a button and the shock always follows that tone. And then sometimes a light occurs after the tone. All right. The rat is not going to associate that light with the shock. It's going to associate the tone with the shock because the tone occurs every single time before that shock occurs. So if the flash of light occurs sometimes, it's not as predictable. It's not a reliable predictor of what's going to happen. So fear is going to instill in that rat's mind when it hears the tone versus when it hears the light, because it's a more valid predictive. It's more repeatable predictable stimulus than per se the light. So what did Rescorla and Wagner show in their discoveries? Well, they showed that an animal can learn the predictability of an event. And the more predictable something is, the stronger the association will be made with that conditioned response. Okay, so it demonstrates that cognition and what happens between our ears is very important, and expectancy and predictability are a cognitive process in conditioning, right? So if you go way back and you look at, or not way back, but if we go back to the first module and we looked at Pavlov and classical conditioning, why did the bell work? Why did that bell work when the dog salivated to the tone? Why did he salivate to the tone? Why didn't he salivate to other stimuluses in the room? And these are good questions that a scientist needs to ask, right? If he's not asking these questions, well, was he responding to the stimulus of his tail wagging? Was it operant conditioning, right? When the dog wagged its tail and then he received food, did the dog make that association? Did the dog make an association of when Pavlov was in the room? That's when the dog received food. When Pavlov itched his left elbow, that meant that the dog was going to receive food. Right? There's so many different pieces of stimuli that the dog could possibly associate that conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. And so What we know through Rescorla's research is that the reason why the tone was the most predictive stimulus in this conditioning process was because it was the most reliable, right? Every time that tone played, food was presented, the unconditioned stimulus was presented. And so it was most salient, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. It was the most salient stimulus in the room. It was the most noticeable, the tone, right? Versus the other conditioned stimuluses. So the dog didn't associate the food with all the other pieces of stimuli in the room, but only the tone. Okay, so further looking at the cognitive processes of learning. It's kind of late, so my head's all over the place, but Edward C. Tolman in the 1930s developed the theory of cognitive mapping and latent learning. So cognitive mapping is a mental representation of a place of one's environment. And in his experiment to explain cognitive learning and cognitive mapping and latent learning, he took a group of rats. He took 3 groups of rats, and the study lasted for about 17 days. And the first group of rats received food in this maze that they had to run through. Every time they received a reinforcement when they reached the end of the maze. So they had a clear objective of learning. The second group received no food. They were just placed in the maze. And then the third group of rats ran around the maze without any reinforcement until the 11th day they began to receive reinforcement. So the rats exploring the maze without the reward, first 11 days, made quite a few errors. And if you look at I'm going to show you here in a minute, if you look at the graph, you just see this gradual kind of steady decline of, they're making a lot of errors. So before they reach the end of that maze, versus the ones that had a clear objective and are receiving food. So what we found was on the 11th day, let's go ahead and go to this map here. On the 11th day, as you can see right here, this group right here, this is the third group that received reinforcement on the 11th day. You see this massive decline. I don't know why my cursor keeps going away. You see this massive decline here, right? Okay. And the reason for this is because they were given a chance to demonstrate their learning, right? Prior to the 11th day, there was really no objective. They didn't understand the point of being in that maze. But when given an incentive to express learning, the rat was able to show that it was building a cognitive map of that maze, and it actually knew its way around it, just as well as these rats that were receiving reinforcement the entire time. So an example of this is you in my classes, right? When you're in my classes. Based on your behavior in my class when I'm sitting here lecturing, or I'm up in front of the classroom lecturing, or we're doing a class activity, it's more challenging for me to notice your behavior and really understand whether or not you're learning the material. But then when I give you a test, right, or I ask you to display your knowledge by teaching, through an assessment, a project or something of that such, I can see, hey, this student is actually learning the material because now they have a platform or an incentive to do so, a time to do so, right? So cognitive mapping just shows us that in latent learning, it's when learning occurs when the situation calls for it, right? So learning is happening, maybe not outwardly at one point in time, but when the situation calls for it, we see that learning is actually occurring. And this is another experiment that was done by Tolman, and it was another maze in which he put this rat here. Let me use this marker again. Okay, this rat, it went through here, came into kind of this common area, went straight up through this tunnel, took a left, took a right, took another right, came all the way down here, and then received that reward, okay, the food reward. And what he did is he had the rat run through this multiple times until it was able to learn this maze pretty well and do it quickly. Then he put the rat in this maze over here on the right. And so first, you got the rat here, goes up through this same tunnel or hallway, and then you see it's blocked. It wasn't able to go anywhere. Now, generally you'd think that after going straight and hitting that blocked path, the rat would choose, all the paths. I mean, it probably wouldn't choose the correct path, but it actually chose the correct option. Sometimes they came over here and they maybe went into this one and found out that it was a dead end. But after one more mistake, they were able to quickly find the food reward here. Okay, now why did this occur? Why was it able to find that so quickly? And the explanation is, again, cognitive mapping. So because that rat has a general idea where that food is, it knows that it's not over here to the left, right? It's going to be somewhere over here. And the reason for this is because it has built a cognitive map from the previous maze of where that food was located. So, for example, you go to a restaurant and you sit down at a table at the right side of the restaurant. Okay. Well, you don't know where the restroom is. It's your first time there, and you ask the waiter, "Hey, could you please tell me where the restroom is?" And then they say, "Oh yeah, go down that hallway, take a right, take a left, and then you'll see it just to the right end of the hallway there." Okay, so you follow the directions, you find it, and then say a couple weeks later you want to take a group of friends back to this restaurant that you really enjoyed, and you need to go to the restroom, but now this time you're sitting on the left side of the restaurant. Okay, you remember where that restroom is because of your cognitive map. You're not going to follow the waiter's exact same directions that he gave you from your prior location, otherwise you're never going to make it to the restroom, right? Okay, so this is cognitive mapping, our ability to have a general idea of where things are. Take that pencil off again. Okay, again, I'm going to have you guys pause this here, and I want you to go through this survey. It's the locus of control survey. The locus of control is just basically our perception about what influences our outcomes and our behaviors. So go ahead, pause it, go through this survey. All right, so hopefully you're able to complete that survey. The highest score you could receive is a 70. The lowest score would be a 10. So, if you haven't already, go ahead and add up all your numbers, see kind of where you end up on this. But the average score for men was 51.8, and the average score for women was 52.2. So, within half a point there, pretty close in terms of the internal-external locus of control. But the difference between these two is that internal locus of control is when our perception of the influences around us and our outcomes is more based on ourselves. Like, I am responsible for my outcome and my future, right? If you have this approach, you are someone who has a much more responsible internal locus of control. And then an external locus of control would be the perception that outside forces influence the outcome of your path, your life path, or your result, more so than yourself. And someone who has a high internal locus of control is generally one, they're going to be more responsible. People are going to like them more. People want to be around them. People want to follow them. Of course, there's got to be a balance to it. You don't want to be entirely internal. You want to also be a little bit aware of the external circumstances around you. But those who are internally focused receive higher grades in school. It's not that they're necessarily more intelligent, right? But it's just the fact that they take responsibility for themselves and their actions. And they also receive higher paying jobs than people with a external locus of control. They receive more opportunities in leadership, and they have less stress and anxiety because they're not worried about everybody else and what's happening over there and what's happening over there and what are they thinking about me and what did she say about me. And they're responsible. They're focused on, hey, if I do this, then I will go here. I'll go this far. Doesn't matter what they think. Doesn't matter what they say. So there's also a lot of health benefits to it. Lower obesity rates, lower blood pressure rates, higher life expectancy for people who have an internal locus of control. So let's go into Module 30 and look at the last bit of learning. We're going to talk about observational learning. So observational learning occurs by watching others and then in turn imitating and modeling the observed behavior. Observational learning is also known as social learning. So Albert Bandura, an American psychologist, was the one who really was the major influencer to this study of imitating, modeling, and observation. And he found that higher functioning animals, especially humans, learn through this process of observing and imitating and modeling someone of influence for a favorable result, right? Or to decrease a behavior because of an unfavorable result. So in this picture here, as you see on the screen, there's two monkeys. There's one on the right and there's one on the left. And there's a screen, piece of glass between them. But they both have a screen in front of them. And so the monkey on the right is the model in the sense that he's doing the behavior, he's doing the action first. The macaque on the left is observing and imitating the behavior of the monkey on the right. Why is he doing this? Well, he's doing this because the monkey on the right receives a reward each time he hits the pictures in a certain sequence, right? So you can see the images there below, and if that monkey hits those images in a certain sequence, he receives a reward. So in this case, the monkey is learning that by doing the same thing as the monkey next to him, he also gets a beneficial consequence. Okay, so in this image, who would the model be? All right, hopefully you pointed to the person on the left, the tennis instructor there, right? He's the person whose behavior is being imitated, right? The subject is watching him, imitating him, and modeling him. In this case, who would be modeling? Right? Hopefully you pointed to these people, okay? They are imitating a specific behavior that this woman here, right, she is the model, they are modeling the model, right? So they're imitating her. Okay, and then what Bandura suggests is that there are 4 requirements needed for effective modeling to actually occur in observational learning. The first is attention, right? So noticing something is happening in the environment. The second is retention, the recall of the activity. The third is reproduction, producing an action that then mimics what was modeled. And lastly, motivation. You have to have some kind of motivator in order to increase or decrease a behavior, right? There's got to be a consequence at the end. So this is when you take B.F. Skinner's influences of reinforcement and punishment, and you apply that to observational learning to increase or decrease behavior. So the Bobo doll experiment by Albert Bandura is probably his most famous research experiment that studies the consequences a model has on other subjects. So in this case, he had 2 groups. He had an experimental group, he had a control group, right? The experimental group were children who watched adults model aggressive behavior. The control group were children who did not watch an adult model aggressive behavior. I'm actually going to show you this clip here in the next slide. And so after they watched this video, what they found was, well, they put these children in a toy room with other toys, and the experimental group showed that the video had a significant impact on their behavior, right? The experimental group displayed serious violence towards the Bobo doll, and they observed and imitated what the model in the video was doing, hitting, kicking, screaming, using violent language towards this Bobo doll. And this was just a child who was did not grow up in an abusive home or anything, but through watching this model influence behavior towards a certain toy, they imitated it exactly and actually took the violence even further than the model. So, however, the control group didn't really show any signs of violence. Now, he also took this experiment a bit further when he used reinforcement and punishment for the behaviors with the Bobo doll. So, for example, he rewarded or punished acts of aggressive behavior, right? And in this case, he saw that children learned through what's called vicarious reinforcement or vicarious learning. The fact that we learn by watching. And it doesn't always have to be interactive like the previous example that I explained. The child didn't have to go in and imitate doing the violent behavior, right? In this case, through vicarious learning, watching, you don't have to necessarily have interactive modeling to learn that, hey, if I press a button and it shocks me, then I shouldn't touch that button. If I see someone touch a button and it shocks them, I'm gonna learn vicariously. Through that person's experience, I'm not gonna go do that to find out if it actually does happen. Okay, so I don't have to always have an interactive modeling. I can also just observe and watch. So let's actually watch this video of the Bandura Bobo doll experiment.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. The model pummeled the doll with the mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. The children in the control group who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. Here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
Okay, so this video is very significant in the study of observational learning, and we see these kids are very much influenced by the model of that video of violence, right? And they took it to another extreme by using guns that weren't even modeled in the video. So this kind of just goes to show you that we need to be careful what we do around children. We need to be careful about what we say. And sometimes we might think it's cute when a kid curses or says something really violent, like "I'm gonna kill you," and in the time it might seem cute, but it's actually really disruptive to that child psychologically, and we need to be careful. So, okay. Why do people get so engaged in watching sports or horror films? The reason for this is because of a specific neuron, right? It's called mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are located in the frontal lobe. They fire both when itself is doing or observing another organism or species acting out that behavior, that action that it's watching. Right, so we have over 100 billion neurons in our brain. Some of those neurons we discussed already were motor neurons. Okay, we know quite a bit about motor neurons. We discovered them a long time ago. Sensory neurons, right, the ability to sense when sensations, right, pressure, warmth, and cold. And then we have intraneurons that communicate through our central nervous systems between our motor neurons and our sensory neurons. Okay. Mirror neurons, however, are a rather new discovery by Rizzolatti in Italy. So he was actually studying motor neurons, and in the process, he came across this new neuron called a mirror neuron, is what he labeled it. And the reason he called it a mirror neuron is because it's involved with mirroring and imitating what we are seeing, right? So in a lab, he was researching monkeys and their brain activity, and what he found was that when the monkey picked up the peanut from the table, the brain fired in the same region as when he picked up the peanut on the table. And so why is this? It's just a peanut. Why is that significant? What is the point there? The point is that mirror neurons in our brain are not just interested in our own actions, but they're also interested in the actions of others. Okay? They adopt the other person's point of view, which is really important for imitation and emulation. So if you look at this brain scan here, you see that the one on the left is related to pain, okay? And there's the brain is firing in the somatosensory cortex, right, in the upper parietal, okay? And then it's also firing there within the frontal lobe region and portion of the temporal lobe there. But what we see is that the brain on the right is just viewing this person go through pain and experiencing what we call empathy. Okay, there's empathy there, in which the brain shows up in these emotional areas, but not so much in the somatosensory cortex when it watches someone else go through physical pain. So this biological structure that's involved with this emotional interpretation we learned in Unit 2 is called the amygdala, right? And in the left hemisphere we have positive emotions, and in the right hemisphere we have these negative emotions. You don't need to know all that, but the point here is the brain activity is related to, on the right is related to the brain on the left. They're both experiencing something at the same time. So when people who are very good at tuning into others' emotions, right? People who are very empathetic, or people who tend to avoid horror movies. Some researchers believe that this is because watching other people activates their mirror neurons near the motor cortex of the brain. And these researchers think that mirror neurons may help us understand what other humans are doing in the physical space by literally mirroring their movements, right? So some evidence shows and suggests that people who are highly empathetic tend to have stronger activation in the mirror neuron region of their brain when watching horror movies, and so therefore they tend to avoid them. Okay, people who are very emotional sometimes, right? They can't handle it. So this just tells us that mirror neurons in the brain are not just interested in our own actions, but also in the actions of others. Okay, I was going to show you guys this video. This lecture is getting a bit long, but I'm going to show you a bit of it.
Gaze into a mirror, and what do you see? Well, I see my face, of course, but in my face, I see moods, I see shifts of feeling. We humans are really good at reading faces and bodies, because if I can look at you and feel what you're feeling, I can learn from you, connect to you, I can love you. Empathy is one of our finer traits, and when it happens so easily, perhaps because, and this is brand new science, this is just out of the lab, we may have some special circuitry in our brains that helps us whenever we look at each other. Ask yourself, why do people get so involved, so deeply, deeply involved, with such anguish, such pain, such nail-biting tension over football?
Cleveland Browns are gambling on defense.
Why are we such suckers for sports? And it's not just sports. We can lose it completely at the movies, at video games, watching a dance. Is there something about humans particularly, that allows us to connect so deeply when we watch other people? Watch them moving, watch them playing, watch their faces. Well, as it happens, scientists have an explanation for this strange ability to connect. It's new.
It had never been found on the cellular level before.
A set of brain cells found on either side of the head. Among all the billions of long branching cells in our brain, these so-called mirror neurons have surprising power.
What we found is the mechanism that underlies something which is absolutely fundamental to the way that we see other people in the world.
And it began entirely by accident at a laboratory in the lovely old city of Parma, Italy, where a group of brain researchers was working with monkeys. And they were testing a neuron, that's a brain cell, that always fired, made this sound, whenever the monkey would grab for a peanut. So the lab had all these peanuts around, and whenever the monkey made its move, the neuron would fire. Scientists thought, now here's a neuron that is essential to motion. It's a motor neuron. Then one day the monkey was just sitting around, not moving at all, just sitting, when a human scientist came into the lab. And when that scientist grasped the peanut, the monkey's cell fired. Now, the monkey hadn't moved. It was the human that had moved, suggesting that this neuron up here couldn't tell the difference between seeing something and doing something. Seeing and doing were the same. Or more intriguingly, that for this neuron, watching somebody do something is just like doing it yourself. The head of the lab, Giacomo Rizzolatti, thought, wow.
The same neurons, one neuron, fire both when the monkey observes something and when the monkey is doing something. It's almost unbelievable.
It was surprising because this cell which was involved with motor planning for the monkey turned out to be interested in the movements of other people as well.
Some people call them monkey see, monkey do neurons, but the name that stuck is mirror neurons, because with them, the brain seems to mirror the movements it sees. This accidental discovery got scientists thinking, doing more tests, and it soon became pretty clear that this is not just a monkey thing, it's a people thing too. We all know that humans learn by looking and copying. That's what infants do. First you look, then you do.
Ready? Let's see your feet this way.
And once you've watched and copied and learned a set of moves, you not only have them in your head.
Look, you put your shoe on. Yeah, she brushed it.
If you see somebody else doing it, you can share the experience.
And want to do it with me?
They know the moves, you know the moves, so you can move with them.
Wow.
If you can use the years of training that you yourself have done, learning to crawl, then learning to walk, then learning to eat, this is an incredibly rich set of knowledge that you could apply to the problem of actually seeing what's going on.
So that's why when I head down this street carrying all these packages, not only do people watch, look how they're watching. They feel my predicament, because they know what it's like to carry heavy packages. They all know about carrying. So as they watch me moving, they can feel themselves moving. Their neurons are mirroring the action. These neurons may be the brain's way of translating what we see so we can relate to the world.
The mirror system is the way that you tap into, the way that you harness your own abilities and project them out into the world.
And people are really good at watching and translating what we see. Like with just 13 moving dots, that's all there are here, you'll have no trouble recognizing these very ordinary activities. What's more, tests have shown when a person sees a movie like this of his own movement, he'll recognize it immediately as his own. And that's why sports fans tense with the action and wince and leap. Because if you know the game, then your neurons are firing as if it's you playing, giving a whole new meaning to the phrase armchair quarterback. That's why it's so easy to be a sports fan. But there is more, suggests UCLA professor Marco Iacoboni. He thinks mirror neurons tie us not just to other people's actions, but to other people's feelings.
So the idea was to try to figure out how the emotional system and this motor system are connected together.
Okay, so we see that mirror neurons really provide us with an understanding of imitation, observational learning, and emulation. And if you actually look into mirror neurons, there's a lot of explanation on how they relate to Eastern philosophy and like reincarnation. So I'm not going to talk about it, but you could look into it if you're interested. Okay, pro-social and antisocial behavior. Cover this briefly, but pro-social behavior is a positive or constructive, helpful behavior, right? An example of that would be, you look at Martin Luther King Jr., someone who was a great example of leading a non-violent protest during the civil rights movement, during an extremely serious issue in the United States on segregation between blacks and whites and unequal rights between the two. And because he was such a powerful leader through his movement, and he stood the test of remaining he remained nonviolent. He had a significant influence on politics and the future of the United States. But then you look at other examples of behavior, right? Antisocial behavior. It's a negative or destructive or unhelpful behavior for society, right? It's chaotic. It's violent. So an example of this you could say is just the influence. Things like drill music. Drill music is a type of music that originated from Chicago in gangs, in gang neighborhoods, and it's now really really popular in the UK and London. But anyways, it originated from Chicago, and it's all about these themes of killing, stabbing, murdering, harming, innocent lives, really for no reason, because it's just kind of the cool thing to do. And there's so much media influence out there today with social media, and there's a lot of opportunities for you to just watch and binge watch violence. You can play video games, and this all leads to desensitization. The reality is, the more violence we watch, the more desensitized we become to that behavior. And so, it's not the only factor, obviously, that leads to why, youth today have become more and more increasingly violent than any other time in history. And it's not all related to gangs either. It's not just gang violence that's the issue. But there, as you can see right now in Hong Kong, there are a lot of youth that have picked up very violent, destructive, immoral behavior based on a lot of influences from society. So it's not crazy to say that observational learning has influenced some of these protests that are even happening within this very country. But just to look at some of these statistics on desensitization and how we can explain a person's response to violence in media, between 1998 and 2006, primetime violence increased by 75%. Violence wasn't even really in films until the 1970s. You know, you didn't see graphic violence, I mean, right? 74% of violence went unpunished in TV shows, right? So that kind of goes to show, like, people may make a correlation there, an association there, that, hey, I can steal, I can vandalize, and it's not a big deal. I'm not going to get punished for it, so why not do it, right? 58% of people of violence, they didn't show the victim's pain, so they only showed the violent action from the one who was inflicting the pain. They didn't show the pain that person was actually experiencing. So then you don't have that empathetic experience with what it feels like to be on that other end of pain, right? And then a study in 2004 showed that children in elementary school who were exposed to violent television, videos, and video games did express an increased amount of aggression when they played with their friends or just interacted with other peers in their classes. So it's something to be aware of, you know. Okay, this is pretty much it for today for this unit. So I know this was a bit of a long lecture, but thank you for hanging in there. Stay safe, everybody, and I hope to see you guys back in school again soon. All right, take care.